Hi, and welcome back to BK Sports Card Stories. I'm Brian, and today I want to talk about one of my other favorite teams, the Atlanta Falcons, and how they got started in the first decade or so of their not so great history. Now, the Falcons started in 1966, and that was after several years of attempts by the Atlanta government as well as the governor of Georgia to try to lure a team to move there from another NFL or AFL city or to get an expansion team. So, one of the key figures in that was Ivan Allen Jr., and he was the mayor of Atlanta in the 60s. And he actually was one of the proponents for helping to integrate the city. He worked with Martin Luther King Jr. on that, as well as other civil rights leaders, and he actually testified on behalf of the Civil Rights Act in support of it at the behest of John F. Kennedy Jr. So, besides that, he also was one of the ones who was trying to get the Falcons there, as well as the governor, Carl Sanders. And to tell this story, I'm going to use some source material from this book here, Tales from the Atlanta Falcons Sidelines by Matt Winklejohn. It has a lot of good information, a lot of great quotes from some of those early founders. This comes from Carl Sanders, the governor, during his meeting with Pete Rozelle, the NFL commissioner. He called up a guy named Rankin Smith, who became the first owner of the Falcons. And he said, "Rankin, what are you doing?" "Well, how'd you like to buy a football team?" "This fellow," Pete Rozelle, "has a plane to catch, so get over here right away." Rankin Smith rushed over there. He met with Pete Rozelle and evidently made a pretty good impression because they were awarded a franchise soon after that. Rankin Smith is an interesting guy. He owned a local business in Atlanta, and he actually went to high school at the Bowl School in Jacksonville, which I used to live in Jacksonville, and so I drove by there fairly often. But the Bowl School is most famous for being the high school of Chipper Jones. And you can actually see he is in his Bowl School uniform there on his 91 tops. So, bet you didn't think a Chipper Jones sighting would happen in a Falcons video, huh? Anyway, Rankin Smith ended up working with Pete Rozelle to get the team, pay the franchise fee, all that kind of stuff. The groundwork needed to be laid besides just the franchise fee. They needed to pick a name. So the name Falcons came from a contest, and it was won by a lady named Julia Elliott of McDonough, which is actually where Atlanta Motor Speedway is on the south side of Atlanta. Her quote for why she chose that name was, "The falcon is proud and dignified, with great courage and pride. It never drops its prey. It's deadly and has a great sporting tradition." So, off to a good start there with a solid name. Then they had to get a coaching staff. They hired a guy named Norb Hecker. He had some good assistants, including this guy here, Tom Fears. He was a wide receiver, or as they called it back then, an end, and is a Hall of Famer. So they had some good experience there on the coaching staff. Then they had to fill out a team. That happened in two stages. Number one, an expansion draft. Now, this card here is from 1966 Philadelphia series. It's got the original Falcons logo because, fans across the country, unless they had seen it in a newspaper or something, wouldn't know what the logo was. So it's got the Falcons logo. But the important thing is on the back here. It has the names and teams of all the players who were chosen in the expansion draft from the 14 existing NFL teams. A couple of ones to note from the Colts, they got Alex Hawkins, who was a good player, but he was also a notorious partier and carouser. And from the New York Giants, they got Ernie Wheelwright, who was a running back, and he'll come into play later. But of all these players, so there were 14 teams, three from each team. A lot of them either refused to report or they were just at the end of their career, so they retired. But they did get a good number of them to report for training camp. The second source of reinforcements was the NFL draft. With the number one pick, the Falcons selected Tommy Nobis, a linebacker, All-American at University of Texas, the consensus best player in that draft. Back then, you had the NFL and the AFL. The Houston Oilers drafted Tommy Nobis, tried to lure him, but he chose to sign with the Falcons. And so that was the first Falcons draft pick ever. He went to become known as Mr. Falcon, and he played for over a decade for the Falcons on some, well, you'll see, really bad teams. And I think he only went to one Pro Bowl because the Falcons were just terrible and he did not get the recognition that he deserved, even though he led the team in tackles for like 8 years. The Falcons also picked an outstanding defensive back named Ken Reeves, and he'll come back in our story a little later. First year in training camp, it was near Boone, North Carolina, and things didn't get better for anybody. They talked about how bad the conditions were. Tommy Nobis said, as far as the showers went, they just took an old storeroom and ran some pipe up the wall, and it just kind of ran out the door. If you didn't get in there early, you weren't going to get any hot water. Talking about the food, we almost had the first NFL player strike over the food. The hamburgers bounced off the floor. The players threatened to go on strike if they didn't improve the food. Several players got food poisoning and ended up in the hospital. I think they even missed the first preseason game. So it was not a very good training camp, and unfortunately didn't lead to a great start to the season. There is one story that's kind of an encapsulation of the first half of that season. The kicker, Wade Trainum, went to kick the ball. Just as I started to meet the ball, I noticed the Eagles dropping back and bunching around the receiver. I decided to change the direction of my kick, and when I cut across the ball, I didn't get enough of it. He strained a thigh muscle and missed the rest of the season, and they had to get an offensive lineman to do the kicking for the rest of the season. As you might guess, things didn't start off well. Falcons started off 0-9, but their first win was kind of inspiring. If you remember, I mentioned Ernie Wheelwright. He was taken from the expansion draft from the Giants, who said they left him unprotected because they didn't need him. Well, he took that very personally there and had a big day rushing and receiving, scored a couple touchdowns, and the Falcons got their first win. There weren't a lot of highlights that first season, but that at least was one of them. After the season, things didn't get any better. The Falcons traded first round pick, number 3 overall, in exchange for veterans Bernie Casey, Jim Wilson, and Jim Norton. Casey never reported to the team. Wilson spent most of the only season on the practice squad, and Norton barely played in 2 seasons in Atlanta. What did the 49ers do? They picked Heisman Trophy winner Steve Spurrier. And then one pick later, Miami chose Bob Greasy, who went on into the Hall of Fame. So a very Falcon-y thing to do. 1967 wasn't a whole lot better. Heading into 1968, Hecker was fired after 4 games after a bad start. They brought in a new coach, Norm Van Brocklin. And he was a Hall of Fame quarterback for the Rams. He was quite a cantankerous guy. It was his way or the highway. Fine players. In fact, one Atlanta sports writer put it this way: Van Brocklin is the kind of blunt soul who could, in a sudden burst of temper, make his mother feel that all the pains of childbearing are not worthwhile. The Falcons were bad in 1968. Falcons did make a few good draft choices, though, including George Coons, a tackle who played several good years for the Falcons. They actually had some decent quarterback play from Bob Berry, had a rotating host of quarterbacks, but found some success with Pat Sullivan, the Heisman Trophy winner out of Auburn. Falcons went 6-8 in 1969, but then they were bad again in 70. But in 1971, they had their first winning season at 7-6-1, and then 7-7 in 1972. Well, going into 1973, there was a little bit more hope. They actually finished 9-5, but due to a tie, they missed the playoffs. Things heading into 1974 looked like they would be pretty good, but the players went on strike, not just for Atlanta, but around the whole NFL. Ken Reeves comes back into play here. He was the Falcons player rep and represented them well for the negotiations. As revenge for that, like I said, Norm Van Brocklin was kind of a piece of work. and he traded Ken Reeves to the rival Saints. In the third game of the season, the Saints beat the Falcons by a point. Reeves had this to say. He said, maybe if the Falcons continue to lose, they'll lose one of the greatest spirit killers in the history of the game, Norm Van Brocklin. So that is a pretty strong statement. And actually, as the 74 season went on, that is exactly what happened. The Falcons kept losing. Van Brocklin had a few more outbursts and tussles with reporters, and he was fired. And this actually ended up being a good thing long term, because in the off season, the Falcons traded George Coons and their first round draft pick for the number one pick in the draft. And that was Steve Bartkowski. And he was the first really good, stable quarterback the Falcons had had in their history. He was the quarterback for over a decade. He led the Falcons to the playoffs, was a very beloved quarterback while he played. But that is a story for another day. That is the story of the early years of the Falcons. Not the prettiest. It's not always easy being a Falcons fan, but I still love them. So that's all I had. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.